We've had a renewed call for there being some sort of intervention in the world of AI. So the copyright holders are up in arms saying that training AI on their data is not appropriate. And you have the AI companies pushing back saying, if we don't train on copyrighted content, then the Chinese are going to do it. So we're going to fall behind and they're just going to win. And there doesn't really seem to be a good resolution to the situation. I was thinking about this and I thought maybe there's a way that blockchains can actually step in here and provide some utility to helping to solve this problem. And that's inspired somewhat by this idea of tariffs and taxes. So if you think about the primary use of where AI generated content is currently being used, it's on social media. I mean, people are making cool pictures where they're styling their photos as particular artists. The whole Studio Ghibli thing comes to mind. And the thing about this content is there's kind of two places where idea could potentially be enforced. First is as the AIs are asked to generate this content, if it's Grok or Claude or OpenAI or something that's very centralized, it's a natural place to do something like that. And then another place that you could potentially be enforcing this is as the social media gatekeepers themselves saying, if you're going to present an image and you want that on social media, you've got to show where it came from. If you created the content yourself, you're the content creator, there could be a way to attest that. Or if your phone shot it, your phone could automatically generate the attestation that you generated the content. And if it's neither of those, then social media could say, well, where did you get this and how do you have this, and show us the tax receipt if you're showing us something. And it could also put some processing power behind that and say, does this look like it could have been AI generated? And if it was AI generated and you don't have an attestation on it, then maybe it just blocked you from posting it. Now, that doesn't stop you from doing things on the broader internet, but it is where most of this stuff is being used. So I think there's something maybe there. Lucas, this is something that's been on my mind. What do you think of these ideas? Can social media be the gatekeeper? Should it start collecting taxes and tariffs for copyright holders? And where maybe do we need to go with this? Because the other thing that I think we need to talk about is when are things supposed to end up in the public domain, and what was the original purpose of copyright?
One, I'm shocked. I tell you to hear the words uttered here that we need taxes, and we need receipts. Um, here on a libertarian show. No, actually, I agree. I absolutely agree. Part of the problem that we've had in the past has been who holds that information. It's not that we're against taxes. It's not that we're against receipts, but the question becomes, what 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 institution do you give that authority and that amount of power to become the holder and the distributor of that information? So I think that is the reason that we've had gray areas, and we've had a notion of a public domain in the past. But in reality, our ideas do not die. We believe in property rights. A great way to express and to maintain the fabric of society is through the the passing of those ideas, the communication of those ideas. And what is money but an accounting or a trail of that type of commerce?
Well, I think thinking about public domain is really a good place to start because things used to have a much shorter lifespan. And I put Steamboat Willie on the cover art for this topic because it was such a long battle for anything related to Mickey Mouse to ever come into the public domain. It was Disney that was primarily responsible for these long extensions of how long things were copyrighted, and they're one of the worst abusers of public domain. If you think about most of the properties that Disney holds dear, these were all public domain stories. They were fairy tales or stories that were well known throughout the world, and a lot of them were German folk tales that Disney took and neutered. Like they had these, very dark moments to them, or they had these extremely, you know, d- you know, d- they were very disturbing elements that were in the stories. And Disney said, well, what if we rip out all of that kind of stuff, boil it down to its barest essence, and then make something accessible for children? And then they became these beloved children's stories that still somewhat in retrospect, many of them have these dark undertones that as people look back, they're starting to even still say, wow, there's some really, questionable things that are in some of these stories that Disney put out, even when they did neuter the stories. So the extension of copyright from being a much shorter period of time to this very long 70 years or whatever it's taken for anything related to Mickey Mouse to make it into the public domain has really hurt what, during at least in the 80s was a big remix culture. If you think about some of the big albums and things that came out, it was chopping up pieces of songs that had already existed and rapping over the top of them, or sampling things. And there was a lot of this kind of freewheeling culture that had happened in the 80s, and then all of that got locked down into the 90s. So I think, the world is still trying to figure out how much is due to somebody who has created something, and how much should be paid if you're going to reuse parts of what someone else has already done. And these things have gotten substantively worse in the age of AI, where you've got a large language model or some kind of a generative AI content model that can understand things that have already been produced and produce things that are substantively similar to that. And with that, being able to produce things that are substantively similar, it requires that they be trained on it. So with an AI, you can directly say that it understands something because it's ingested copyrighted content. It would have no ability to generate it if it hadn't. So saying that a large language model or a generative AI doesn't have that copyright material in it, it's obvious if it understands it, if it can generate content that's substantively similar. So I think the enforcement of this and saying that the AI has ingested that copyrighted content is fairly easy to prove, fairly easy to say. Now it's just a matter of whether these large language models come with some kind of a receipt saying that I generated it, and if it is keeping track of what it's generated in the past and then taking responsibility for it. These types of things, I think, are what's on my mind.
Well, and I remember very well the extension of the copyright. I must have it's occurred in my lifetime, and I remember uh, having some sort of expectation that Mickey Mouse or whatever would come into the public domain, and instead we were thwarted. But then when I think about the works that are in the public domain, um, this is I guess I'm to the point I've changed in my position with regards uh, to respecting intellectual property and thinking about intellectual property. But in the world of my youth, my adolescence, there were prices that were ridiculous for music, for CDs, um, uh, for movies, for books, and it would be inconceivable in that old world also for people to have been, say, uh, registering and presenting or claiming dominion over all of the, say, photographs that they took. But we can do that now. We have more sophisticated communication. We have public and shared blockchains that can have that can be used not for passing around coins or like holding value themselves, but can be conveying information. And so when you're talking about receipts, um, I imagine you're thinking about NFTs, because that's what it is a digital receipt, and we haven't seen it used in such a way. But as the world talks about tokenization of assets, um, that's the world that we're stepping into.
NFT really does, to me, feel like a receipt, and many have claimed that's really what you're getting when you buy an NFT. It's more of a demonstration of sale than it is the content itself. And as we've seen NFTs age and in many ways rot, it's become apparent that unless the data is put on the blockchain itself, that it's not a durable way to hang on to the data, and that any attempts to hang on to the data in anything other than a blockchain is very brittle and very subject to digital rot. The whole internet has this problem, like the rotting away of the internet and the rotting away of our history and our culture is has been a big problem. And that's why, the attacks on things like the Internet Archive are so shocking and so really detrimental to us as having any kind of history in the age of digital media, because these things are so ephemeral, like they don't feel like it at the time, but as you start to try to look back, you find that a lot of the things that you had been looking at have rotted away, that they're not there anymore. And this has been lamented where certain sites have shut down and they just dump all the content, and so big chunks of the internet are just starting to be broken links. And NFTs had that same problem. Like the links are just broken. Whatever the art or image it was supposed to point to is gone. And so the idea that an NFT is more of a receipt of sale and that there's a hash associated with the media makes it feel like it works better for that than anything else. Going back to this idea that there's a remix culture, it brings to mind Paul's Boutique by the Beastie Boys. I think it's been said that if this album was tried to be created under the new rules, that it would be so prohibitively expensive because of the amount of samples that were used that you really couldn't even make this record. So the idea that remix culture and that all this stuff should eventually go into the public domain has been a thing that really artists have wanted. It's the Some artists are very protective of their art, and then other artists want to remix stuff that they find other people are using and make something new out of. And so the idea that AI can be inspired by stuff that artists are doing, artists are inspired by what other artists are doing, and that the whole culture benefits from this swirl of ideas that go into the mix, and people put kind of a new spin on it, and new stuff that can come out of it, I think is beneficial. It's more the question of how much should somebody get paid for some novel thing that they've produced, and how long should they get paid for it. And that also harkens to this idea of invention and how much you should be able to get paid for a patent, because a patent is only a limited duration under which you can monetize your idea, but then it goes into the public domain so that anybody can use it and that all of society benefits. The patent is your limited license to have it, so that there's a reason for you to publish and not hold it back, so that everybody benefits eventually and that all of society is enriched by this swirl of ideas. I think the thing that we have to get right and that we really have to start thinking about is how much, how long, and what are the mechanisms. And I think that you hit the nail on the head, saying in times past it would have been really hard to think about how to do all of this right. It's one of the things that AI does really well. If you think about, if an AI can understand an image and say it looks like blah, or generate me something that looks like blah, then that thing that it's doing is the ability to semantically understand what an image looks like, what a piece of art looks like, what a sound looks like, and does it sound substantively similar to anything else. The AI is really good at that, so let's leverage it. Let's make the AI actually attest what is in there. Maybe there's something that comes along with the receipt that says here's the prompt, or here's the stuff that it looks substantively similar to, and that might even look only machine readable, so that that NFT that's generated has enough metadata on it that another AI can look at it and be like, yes, I understand that what you did was remix a whole bunch of these things. Therefore, here's the amount of royalties that should get paid out when this thing gets published in any way. And if you don't have that receipt, you just can't post it here. You can keep it for your own private use. You can keep it for your own private enjoyment. But if you want the rest of the world to see it, if you want to monetize it yourself, then you've got to share by providing some amount of royalties to the other people that you remixed off of.
When you say, we need to rethink how long the window of patent or copyright exists, I think maybe we don't need to be thinking about in terms of this public domain. What we should be thinking about are, what's the time window for the price that's set in an auction. And there's also a question of who sets the price. Does the artist set the price, or does the consumer set the price? So I like the notion of auctions. That's also something that's been difficult to conceive of in the past, but begins to take away from a question of who's in control, and what sort of vibrancy we can have in public spaces. If there's not a lot of money for people to be licensing this content with, then it'll be cheaper for everybody. And some ideas are better. Some ideas are also have some ideas are a little bit early too. So I'd give 25 cents to read the works of Lysander Spooner today. I don't know if I would have given 5 cents whenever he wrote them.
Think about what the public domain really is, because we're talking about the price and the duration. Public domain says that the price is zero after a certain amount of time. There's nothing to say that that can't have some kind of smooth curve downward, and it's also nothing to say that the price can't be based on an auction. I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. Thinking about how royalties worked, or at least how they were supposed to work on Chia, is that the artist set the royalty. There was some kind of perpetuity, but you could also think about the royalty being some kind of a function, or a curve, or a function of time. So saying, in the first year, the royalty is 20%, and 5 years from then it's 3%, and then at some point in the future it's zero. And because I've generated some novel type of art style or something like that, that's never been seen before, and the AI can tell me, like, I've created something new on this planet. Congratulations, here's your limited license of 40% because you've created something which has never existed.
Well, if you think also about how especially internet and social media, our communication is paid for. It's paid for through advertising. It's paid for through these other entities. And we were talking about Disney earlier. Disney is a box that ideas come out of, and some people are monetized more than other creators in Disney. That doesn't have to be the case in the future, and we might be more disposed to thinking about extending or agreeing with the extension of the intellectual property rights for the cartoons that Disney has created, if the artists and those people who are working on it were being monetized going forward. I mean, in a way, we're talking about workers' rights here too, and people being rewarded for their contributions towards the vibrancy of our world. So as we begin to open up this concept of intellectual property and I don't know, the fractionalized and the extension of those rewards, we can change what the whole. I don't know anyone who enjoys their experience on YouTube or any of these social media platforms. Nobody likes ads. It's a terrible system. If we had our druthers, I think everybody would prefer to be sending money directly to the creators. And you bring up the royalties on Chia NFTs. In a way, that royalty price is just a percentage. So it is also bound to that notion of the market going forward into the future. But it's not, or maybe there are NFTs that exist, but like, what's the time window? There could be possibly a time window price or an expiration of what that license is, and a renewal of the auction for the right to distribute or to use that information. I think we need to see that sort of ecosystem emerging to make this viable.
As we think about how that other side could potentially work, most of the content that's generated today is generated digitally, or it's digitized using a mechanism that most of us are carrying around. It's our phones. So a lot of content is being taken, either a video that's being shot with a phone, a picture that's being shot with a phone, or a piece of content that's being digitized somehow with a phone. Phones are an easy place to start generating these attestations or these receipts, or the way that you can say this was generated by a specific user at a specific time, and it's not some other type of thing that was found on the internet. That's an easy one. The other thing that oftentimes artists are using iPads, Procreate, tools that show proof of creation. Like they actually keep track of every single movement, keystroke, brush stroke, pen stroke. There are these ways that are so human that I think in total they are a way to demonstrate that a human generated something versus an AI which springs to life. I think it'd be a lot harder for AI to generate things in a way that looked human, because when humans generate things, they make mistakes and they do all kinds of weird stuff and extra keystrokes and things that really don't need to be done but are being done because humans kind of fumble their way through something. So I think there's a fairly obvious way that a lot of content can be self-attested as being generated by a specific person at a specific time with some totality. Now, whether those things can be faked, whether those things can be broken, I don't think is as germane, because there's always a way to break things. But whether some normative path makes sense for how we can start to reason about the world and put things together in a reasonable way. So I think that there's something here, and as lawmakers or people that are having this fight, because this fight is happening, right? We're seeing that companies are getting sued. Content creators are very upset that their copyright data is being ingested into AI models, and there's this call for whether it's an opt-in or an opt-out situation. If you've been sticking with the news on this, and we've covered some of this topic before, but there's been recent developments where there's been a renewed call to say that artists would have to go to each AI model and specifically opt out, and that's been largely criticized. And the AI, model producers are pushing back, saying if we don't just ingest everything on the planet, the Chinese are going to take over, and we're going to be left behind. So we're forced to do this because it's the only way that we can compete. And if you want competitive AI coming out of the US and out of the Western world, you have to let us do this. And if you don't want your data in here, then you got to come bang on our door and say you don't want in. That's certainly a part of the conversation here, is what is the mechanism under which content creators and people who have something to protect or feel like that they're being infringed upon their rights, what is the mechanism under which they actually go through and decide whether they want to be included in the model or not?
When you talk about this deciding on being included in the model or not, it makes me think of Usufruct. Are you familiar with the word Usufruct?
Tell me more about Usufruct. I'll see if I can find it on Wikipedia.
Yeah, Usufruct. Strange word, but it actually comes from, well, of course, it's Latin. You can tell by the way it sounds. But it comes from Latin concepts of land ownership. And a landowner had the right of abusus, or to destroy what they had created. They had the right of usus, and the right, or to use that land, or the right of fructus, to sell the fruits of that land, to sell the crop off the land. So I think one, I think it is not, it is, how do I put this? It is, we should begin to separate again this notion of usus and fructus, because as we get into the derivatives of the creation of that, that's the fructus. The information that the AI generates, well, that should be monetized along the fructus right. and there should be a usus licensing right that goes with it. But we should also bring back into the concept the abusus right, and that is for the creator to say, I've had enough. I don't want this to be on the market anymore. I want to destroy the idea that I've made. And I would say that the abuses should apply only to the uses, but the fructus lives out in the world, and the creator cannot destroy that, or the creator of the initial idea cannot destroy the fruits of the idea. So um, this this I think will become again more uh, an something that we have to address, because we have the sophisticated technology to begin to track where these non-corporeal things where they roam and are used in the world.
The mechanism, I think, is also somewhat interesting for how this all might work. There's a pretty easy path if you think about what a blockchain can fundamentally do. So blockchains that exist in the world right now, these public use blockchains where anybody can pay to put something on that database. There's been a lot of debate in the world of Bitcoin about what data is supposed to be going on there and can you police it. I think we've almost arrived at the point of saying there is no ability to police it. If there's any ability to put any data in this public use database, which is what a blockchain is, then you really can't police it at all, and you have to let anybody do it. And blocks are for sale. Let the market decide what those blocks will be used for, whether you're putting monkey pictures in there or whether you're going to put a hash of content in there. You can't stop it. The mechanism under which this would work for what we're talking about is if you're a content creator and you've created something novel, it's something which, in some way is new, has never existed before, and could potentially be used as training data in the future, you would take all the pieces of art that you have created, and before you publish them, you publish hashes of all that data. And then when you publish that data, it is demonstrable that you're the one that put those hashes into the database, that your art hashes to those specific things, and that you have a specific time when you generated it, and that it's novel. That seems like a very easy mechanism, and also one that has almost no cost. Because if you think about what is the cost of putting a hash into the database, it's almost as cheap as it could possibly be, because that's a very small piece of data, but there's almost no way for that hash collision to exist. So once you reveal the data itself, that hash being on the blockchain demonstrates that you put it in there and that it was your content that went in. And that is a pretty powerful mechanism that works for just about everything. It's proof of creation. It says that you're the one that created it at a very specific time because you're in control of the private keys that put those hashes on there. And it also works for things like establishing new inventions or new ideas. Because if you wrote a book, or if you have some sort of a thing that you're ready to show the world, it demonstrates that you did it at a specific time and you did it before anybody else, because the the blockchain acts as a timestamp database. It says this content was put in at a specific time and it's immutable and you can't change that. So it really does serve this very broad need for how do you establish who did something, when did they do it, and when does the clock start ticking on when they actually show the world what they've done. And if somebody else consumes that data, like an AI or another artist, who it is that we should be going to try to find to pay them some portion of the proceeds of whatever else gets used in the remix culture later. If you've created some new art style that the world suddenly loves, like what happened with Studio Ghibli, that you're getting some amount of monetization off of it because that art style is yours and everybody loves it and they want to ape into it. And instead of asking you to generate it directly, the AI can generate it for them, and then you just get a little cut of that, what's been produced. I think there's something here, and I think the company that ends up finding a way to do this is going to be a substantive player in the world of how we actually deal with AI and humans and content creation moving forward.
You mentioned earlier the rot, the rot that occurs on metadata that's tagged into NFTs, and how important it is for that information to be actually recorded onto the blockchain. But then I think about the fee pressure of all of that information being recorded into blocks, and I think our conversation yesterday about the forks on Chia become very interesting if you think about the ability to share the consensus security apparatus and make copies, and we could, as I think about what this might look like in the future, I think, oh, there's a copy of Chia, and it is associated with an LLM model. The information that is put into the LLM model has a receipt that's generated to it, and a wallet that somebody may or may not claim for the NFT that's stored there, and is receiving the token layer being deposited into it for the use and the fruits of the information that or the content that they have tracking. Is this something like what you imagine we would see?
I don't think a fork or anything like that's really needed. When you think about the amount of data, even if we were to contemplate the amount of data that's being generated, there's ways to roll these things up, and I immediately think about something like data layer. And data layer, we've thought about this as something that's so unique to Chia, but it's really something that would work pretty well on just about any blockchain. The fundamental concept that's needed for anything like data layer is just that you have a mechanism for putting hashes onto the chain. And for something like data layer, you have this external database, and what you're doing is you're taking a hash of that database and then putting that checkpoint hash into the blockchain so that you know what the correct state of the database is, because you can look up the hash. So, really there's the ability to scale this idea to any size by a relatively obvious mechanism. So there's not really a scaling issue here, because anytime you can think about, well, I don't have enough space to do it because there's too many hashes that would need to go on the chain, then you just create a database of hashes, and then you put the hash of that onto the blockchain. And so you can do rollups in that sense. So there isn't really a scaling problem with this. It's more just what is the actual distribution mechanism of the associated content. And so far, it's been hard to distribute large pieces of data and not have them rot away. But if there's something that's actively being used, then you could think about any mechanism that allows for the wide distribution of data, like BitTorrent, to do something like this. And I think marrying those two pieces of technology really hasn't been done in a way that makes large content distribution makes sense. But I think for something like this, where you have the AIs that would need to be looking at this data pretty constantly, then it would be the AIs themselves that would be replicating this data as more content gets generated. So it seems to me that the scaling mechanisms really aren't going to be an issue, especially if you have always on computer systems like AI agents that need access to content data and need to have the hashes for that content data. So I'm not sure the fork really comes into play, but there is a means to scale this out if it really came down to getting implemented.
I was just thinking of the fork because it might provide some isolation from, I guess, the fee pressure for the blocks on Chia. And I also, I can see Apple or Kodak or in Facebook or other companies that implement this, but you have a problem of their centralized control. And going back to the problems that we've seen before of the holder of that information deciding that that's the rents that they make off that can be problematic. So I really like the idea of it being a public blockchain with a distributed distributed consensus security and support to 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 forestall that sort of manipulation as to the price or what's going on with the distribution of the content. Um, so maybe not. Maybe I'm still too excited about forks, but I enjoyed learning about those yesterday. Anything else that you have in mind with regards to what we are going to be seeing in the future with AI and intellectual property rights?
That kind of sums it up for me. I just as I still see these problems being brought to the forefront in different lawsuits, and as AI companies seem to be struggling with this, I think there's a path forward, and it just seems like blockchain solves a particular problem, and I'm always on the lookout for, can blockchain solve real world problems? Can it do things that have never really been contemplated before? And how might they do that? And I think that this is a good application of it. And I think this idea of NFTs has been something where we experimented with the technology, we tried its use under some things, and using it for receipts and title hasn't really been done in a broad way. So I'm looking forward to somebody picking this up and doing something with it. I think its time has come, and I think that this will be something that is done in the future. And so I'll be on the lookout for, whatever company or public domain, or maybe even a government that decides to step in, and this is how they're going to regulate AI, because this idea of AI regulation is likely coming, and I don't think it's genuine to say that the Chinese are just going to ignore copyright law and none of this is going to work, because then they're going to be out there as a rogue state. And I don't think the Chinese want to be out there as a rogue state, not playing by the rules of the rest of the world. I think that they're going to rapidly find themselves in a place where they have such superior technology that they want the world to embrace it, rather than being somewhere out on the fringe where they're ignoring international law. So I'm looking forward to this being some kind of global mechanism, and we'll see if it happens. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but that's all I've got.
Well, if China does steal that information, we'll just sanction them.
That's all it takes, right? Let's put tariffs on them and just impose sanctions. Worked. I don't think it worked well, but we'll see. All right, we'll see you next time on FOMO.